Lila avançava com passos vacilantes entre as pedras quentes e as sombras do entardecer. O coração apertado pelo medo e uma tênue chama de esperança queimar em seu peito. Em seu bolso, a mensagem do pai, simples e desesperada. Help us, we have no place to go. A decisão de cruzar o terreno árido rumo aos Apache era um risco imenso, mas a urgência de salvar sua família a impulsionava contra toda desconfiança ancestral. O deserto se estendia diante dela como um mar silencioso, onde o sol castigava a pele como um ferro em brasa, e o vento carregava partículas de poeira que arranhavam a garganta. Cada passo deixava rastros que pareciam fugir da dura terra ressequida. O cheiro seco das plantas retorcidas misturava-se à fragrância distante da madeira queimada. A vastidão hostil da fronteira parecia contar histórias antigas de luta e sobrevivência. E naquele silêncio, Lila sentia o peso dos olhos invisíveis que a observavam. Era uma mulher marcada pela dor e pela coragem. Sua fazenda devastada, a memória do pai adoentado e a imagem dos colonos cruéis a assombrando. A urgência pulsava em suas veias, um misto de medo do desconhecido e a necessidade desesperada de um aliado. No seu coração, a batalha entre a desconfiança histórica dos Apache, a quem fora ensinada a temer, e a esperança de salvação que só eles poderiam trazer, se dissipava no desejo de vida. À distância, sombras se movimentavam com precisão calculada. Uma patrulha militar surgia na trilha em sua direção. O bater das botas no solo seco soava como tambor de caça, e o frio da apreensão se enroscava na sua espinha. A voz áspera do líder ordenava que parasse, questionava suas intenções. A captura parecia inevitável, e o desespero crescia como uma tempestade, prestes a desabar, quando de repente uma figura escura emergiu do entrevero de árvores menores. Um guerreiro Apache, Nantan, com olhos que carregavam o peso da terra e a força ancestral de seu povo. Ele avançou com calma e decisão, entrelaçando-se na tensão do momento, afastando os soldados com um gesto firme. Protegendo Lila, conduziu-a através do véu da suspeita para o coração do acampamento Apache, um reduto feito de pedras, fogo e silêncios carregados de histórias não contadas. Lila, frágil, mas não quebrada, sentiu o alívio misturar-se com a ponta de uma nova inquietação, pois mesmo protegida, desconhecia o que o futuro lhe reservava em meio àqueles olhos estranhos. Chegando ao conselho tribal, Nantan a apresentou com cuidado, mas a súplica de Lila ecoou no ar pesado, recebida apenas por olhares desconfiados e mentes divididas. O silêncio instaurou-se, denso e cortante, como uma espada invisível pendendo sobre o seu destino. Naquele instante, todas as esperanças, os medos e as vidas inteiras que carregava ficaram suspensas no limiar da decisão daquele povo antigo, um julgamento que poderia salvar ou condenar. Muitos companheiros de jornada que acompanham nossas lendas por estas terras esquecidas nos contaram que o destino, ou o algoritmo traiçoeiro do YouTube, às vezes desfaz suas inscrições sem aviso, antes que a próxima trilha perigosa se revele e uma nova reviravolta aconteça. Dê uma espiada rápida aí embaixo do vídeo e garanta que você ainda está inscrito em nosso bando para não perder o fio da meada. Não queremos que você perca nenhuma das vozes que ecoam desse vale. Verifique sua inscrição agora e junte-se à nossa saga. The camp stirred cautiously beneath a paling sky. Shadows lengthening as murmurs rippled among the Apache gathered near the fires. Lila, cloaked in worn fabric, caked by dust and sweat, stood apart, her eyes tracing the jagged horizon where the last light bled out. The weight of countless gazes pressed down on her, silent, curious, suspicious. Here, every breath felt tangled. With history, with grudges unspoken and memories sharp as arrows, Nantan remained close, his dark gaze unreadable but unwavering. He was her reluctant guardian, a living emblem of the ancient code she wished to understand and feared. The first morning in the camp had been cold, the coldness of skepticism. Though he spared no protection, Nantan's stance was a constant reminder. She was still an outsider, a fragile thread woven into a tapestry, tight with vigilance and pain. As dawn cracked, the camp's whispers grew urgent. Leela meandered along the edge of the communal fire ring, her fingers tracing the rough bark of a nearby mesquite. The scent of charred wood mingled with the dry earth and bitter herbs. Nantan's voice broke the silence, low and quiet. These are hard times for us all. The soldiers and settlers come like vultures. Trust is a brittle thing. She nodded, swallowing her pride. I do not seek to bring more harm. My family is lost, without a place to turn. Their words forged a fragile bridge, but the rest of the tribe watched with folded arms and narrowed eyes. Within the circle of fires, faces aged and worn by sun and battle showed lines carved by sorrow and suspicion. The Apache lived with the constant burden of being hunted, pressed between promises broken and legends twisted into threats. During the long hours that stretched beneath the unforgiving sun, Leela learned silently, absorbing customs and codes that were often unspoken. Watching Nantan, she glimpsed a man bound by honor and fury, a protector whose fury simmered just beneath the surface, a storm held back only by custom and necessity. Suddenly, a sharp cry shattered the fragile calm. A scout burst into the camp, his skin sweaty and face etched with urgency. He knelt before the council, breath ragged. The militia moves closer. Tracks found near the hill to the north. Large numbers, armed, ruthless. Murmurs erupted in fierce murmurs that prickled the skin. Eyes flicked towards the dusty pathways, where shadows shivered like ghosts fleeing the heat. The council's elders exchanged grim looks, the weight of hard decisions settling like dust on old bones. Their homeland, fragile as a dried leaf, was under siege again. That night, beneath an ink-black sky, spattered with sharp stars, the council convened. Around the fire, faces bore the flicker of flames and fear. Leela sat near the outer edge, her heart hammering a wild rhythm against ribs caged by anxiety. Nantan stood tall as he spoke, voice steady but edged with steel. This woman has brought us a message. Her plight is real, as is ours, but the danger grows. To harbor the displaced may bring ruin upon us all. Old voices rose in opposition, hardened by years of pain. We cannot shelter strangers if it costs our lives, whispered one aged warrior, eyes glinting with tired caution. Another added, trust fractures here as easily as the dry earth breaks underfoot. Yet some faces softened, haunted by ghosts of their own disrupted pasts. Lila watched as divisions deepened, a canyon carved by fear and desperation. She felt the precariousness of her position sharpen, caught between hope and survival, between ancient enmities and a drive to protect. As the night deepened, silence fell once more, heavy, expectant. Suddenly, a figure burst through the camp's perimeter. A young messenger, dust clinging to sweat-darkened skin, breath ragged. He fell to one knee by the council fires, voice trembling with dread. Refugees gone missing, last seen beyond the river bend. Militia tracks follow their trail. They hunt without mercy. The fire seemed to dim. The words hung like a cold wind, creeping through the bones of the camp. Unspoken fears crystallized into sharpened resolve. Tomorrow, everything would change. Lila's fingers clenched the edge of her shawl, heart pounding louder against the thunderous silence. Beside her, Nantan's eyes narrowed, the flicker of old wounds reigniting as he gazed toward the uncertain horizon. The night held its breath, and in that suspended moment, the first shadows of the coming storm began to gather. The messenger's warning was clear. The militia was closing in on those lost refugees. The danger was no longer distant. It was imminent. Nantan led Lila across the dusty clearing to a small cluster of lodges, their woven hides flickering orange in the firelight. The steady murmur of the camp buzzed just beyond. But here, in the shadow of towering mesquites, a sister awaited, a figure wrapped in quiet strength. Taina, his sister, stood tall and unyielding, her dark eyes holding a tempered fire that matched the flickering flames. "You will meet her now," Nantan said softly, his voice heavy with unspoken warning. "She will test you." Lila swallowed, the weight of the camp's suspicion pressing even harder. She had traveled miles with nothing but a fragile hope and a desperate plea. Now, this warrior would decide something deeper than her words. Could she prove herself worthy? Taina's gaze appraised Lila with a sharp flicker, as though seeing through the dust-stained fabric to the heart beneath. "Why come to us?" Her tone was neither cruel nor kind, simply steady, demanding truth. Lila stepped forward, voice trembling but fierce. "Because there is nowhere else. My family, they have lost everything. The men who took our land, they show no mercy. I carry the hope of bodies too weak to walk, and a plea from my dying father. We need shelter." Taina's eyes narrowed, brows pulling together like a storm gathering. "You speak of hope, yet you bring strangers into our midst. The soldiers and settlers come hungry for blood. Why should we trust your kind?" The fire crackled, shadows flickering over faces, drawn tight with years of loss. Lila glanced toward Nantan, whose pressed lips revealed the struggle between loyalty and caution. He said nothing, only watching the fragile thread that stretched between them. "We all have lost," Lila said, a quiet fire kindling in her chest. "I'm not here to spill more blood. I want to fight to protect, not to destroy." Taina's silence was a verdict. Then, slowly, the camp's chatter settled into tense murmurs. Around the embers, groups of warriors exchanged looks, some skeptical, others faintly hopeful. Wars past and present, tangled in the air, like dust kicked up by horses' hooves. The old wounds were raw. Just then, the edge of the camp erupted in startled voices. A scout burst in, dirt smearing his sweat-soaked face, eyes wide with urgency. He knelt before the council, breath heaving like the dry wind outside. Militia patrols have been spotted near the northern ridge. Large numbers. They track the missing refugees. A hush fell like a heavy blanket, suffocating hope. The elders exchanged grim glances, the lines of their faces deepening with the weight of repeated sorrow. This was no chance encounter. The enemy advanced, relentless and merciless. Taina's hand shifted to rest briefly on Leela's shoulder, a small, unspoken offer of solidarity, before she turned back to the circle of firelight. Within the council, voices rose, clashing like stones thrown in a restless river. "We are weak to harbor outsiders," an elder hissed, his voice ragged with years of fear. "Our people bleed already. How can we risk more? But we cannot turn blind," a younger warrior snapped back. "Even our blood was once a stranger's to this land." Leela felt the pull of the old divisions. The canyon carved deep through this people, through herself. The fragile hope she carried seemed to waver against the tides of mistrust. Yet, somewhere beneath the surface, a pulse of resolve, the stubborn flame of survival, refused to be snuffed. Outside, the camp held its collective breath, every rustle of leaf and creak of leather amplified by the looming threat. Nantan spoke again, voice steady, but edged with a weight that seemed to bend the night itself. "It is perilous to shelter those cast from their homes, but turning away will not save us from the coming storm." Taina's gaze hardened. "Then we prepare. We will defend this ground, no matter who stands beside us." Leela's heart surged, clutching to her the flicker of belonging she dared not claim aloud. Later, under a sky heavy with stars, she lent her hands to tend wounds of a battered boy, his eyes full of confusion and fear. Quietly, she shared whispered stories of distant greenery, of home and hope, the fragile bonds of empathy weaving slowly between her and the young warriors. The night deepened, sharpening every shadow. A figure cloaked in darkness moved like a ghost along the perimeter, eyes flickering with intent. Word spread swiftly. A spy. Nantan and Taina mobilized a patrol, their steps silent as shadowfall, instincts coiled like springs. From the firelight, Lila watched the camp strain against the oppressive quiet, a knot of tension tightening inside her. When the spy was captured, dragging the heavy weight of secrets, the grim truth slipped out. Orders to destroy, to erase any who seek refuge in this land. The militia's hatred was a relentless fire. The camp, once fractured, now bristled with unspoken unity. They were all bound by the same threat, the same desperate need to survive. But even as Leela found her place slowly knitting together with those who stood beside her, she could sense the fragile trust still building, thread by thread, ready to fray at the slightest pull. The wind whispered warnings among the mesquites, footprints fresh as trembling leaves at dawn. Nantan's eyes narrowed, nostrils flaring with the scent of danger closing in. The storm was nearing, and with it, the crucible that would demand everything they held dear. In the silent pause before dawn, the camp braced as one. The next attack would come in mere hours. Leela moved through the camp with renewed purpose, her hands steady as she passed bandages and water to those wounded in skirmishes with the militia. The low murmurs around her began to shift, no longer merely whispers of suspicion, but cautious acknowledgments of the strength she brought. Sweat clung to her brow, smudging the dust on her face, but she ignored the fatigue that pressed against her bones. In this harsh land of sun-baked earth and restless ghosts, every act of kindness was a rebellion against despair. Nantan walked close, his gaze quietly approving as he observed her. Where before his presence reminded her of everything she did not know, now it felt like the steady beat beneath a growing rhythm of trust. Taina, too, had loosened the strict line of her jaw when Leela spoke of strategies, how to set early watches, how to move silently between dunes, warning signals drawn from the whispers of the wind. The tribe's youth gathered around them during the evenings, drawn to the firelight and Leela's words, something fragile yet fierce bridging their worlds. Still, the elders watched from shadowed tents, lips pressed tight, eyes unblinking. Old stories clung to them like soot, tales of betrayal, of broken promises, of blood spilled for land and pride. For every spark of hope, a colder gust of doubt swept in. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind dusty mesas, Leela accompanied Nantan on a routine patrol near the camp's edge. The desert air tasted dry, the wind stirring. Tangled grasses that disputed their hold on the cracked earth. Their horses tread softly, hooves muffled against a patchwork of sand and stone. Suddenly, a shrill cry, frantic, piercing, cut through the stillness. Ahead, they spotted smoke rising thin and restless from a small fire, flickering like a skeleton hand reaching from the earth. Then, figures burst from the scrub, a desperate band of colonists, eyes wild, breaths ragged, pursued by angry voices and pounding hooves. Without hesitation, Nantan wheeled his horse between the colonists and their hunters. Leela's heart thundered as pistols snapped and shouted commands echoed. But rage froze in the faces of their pursuers once they saw the inscrutable determination in Nantan's stance. The warrior's presence was like a wall, harsh and unyielding. A child no older than 7 limped behind, face streaked with dirt and tears. Leela knelt, lowering her supplies in a rough saddlebag, offering water, a rag for the bleeding leg. His hesitant fingers closed around her own, trembling beneath calloused palms. For a moment, the desert noises faded, the distant baying, the clatter of hooves, replaced by the fragile pulse of a bond forged in terror and hope. Nantan's voice was low, weaving commands that spoke of honor and warning. This land is torn, but there is space for those who fight to protect, not to conquer. His eyes, dark embers reflecting a painful past, flicked to Leela. You stand where few outsiders survive. The colonists gathered cautiously, fear curling around their defiance. Leela's pulse quickened. Here, between the dust and the cruelty of the frontier, the lines blurred. They were all trapped between survival and extinction. Returning to camp, the weight of the encounter lingered. Conversations sparked in corners of the lodges, the youth now chattering with a surging mix of respect and curiosity toward the outsider who had saved the child. Yet the elders' faces hardened, their voices a cold current beneath the warmth of the fires. Night fell dense and heavy, swallowing the flickering lights until only whispers danced like restless ghosts. The camp had barely settled when movement stirred near the periphery, a shadow, swift and deliberate, threading silently between the lodges. Nantan and Tina rose instantly, their figures sharp silhouettes against the firelight. Alongside a few trusted warriors, they slipped into the dark, senses coiled like springs. Leela watched, breath shallow, as silence stretched taut. Moments later, the patrol returned, dragging a figure cloaked in shadow, a spy. His face was pale beneath grime, lips cracked and trembling under the weight of secrets forced from reluctant jaws. Under the council's watchful gaze, the spy confessed with a trembling voice. The militia's orders were merciless and absolute. They sought not just to chase away, but to eradicate every displaced soul clinging to these lands, Apache and refugee alike. A cold stillness followed, as if the breath of the camp had frozen. The firelight dimmed under the gravity of the threat. Yet, from that stark terror arose a fragile unity. Wary eyes met, hands clenched and released slowly. The hunters and the hunted, bound together by a shared resolve to survive. Leela's heart beat fiercely in the silence. Her place among them no longer questioned, but carved by courage and necessity. But unease clung to the night air, like a stubborn shadow. Whispered fears stirred as the camp strained to listen for footsteps beyond the reach of firelight. At dawn, Nantan led a patrol that crossed the rough ridge to the north, his keen gaze caught by fresh footprints stamped deep in the dust, the telltale sign of armed men. The earth itself seemed to warn. The storm was not approaching. It had arrived. He returned with a rigid set to his shoulders, voice low but heavy. The militia moves closer. Hours, maybe less. We prepare to stand or to run. The fires of the village flickered uncertainly, as eyes met in silent understanding. Tomorrow, the fragile hopes they'd begun to weave could be shattered or forged anew. But the boundary between safety and ruin had grown perilously thin. Under the heavy veil of dawn, the camp held its breath. The next attack was coming, swift, brutal, and unavoidable. The captured figure dragged toward the center of the camp was a shadow of desperation, a man cloaked in grime, his face taut with fear and sweat that mingled with the dust of the trail. His eyes darted nervously, as if searching for an escape that the firelit circle around him denied. The silence hung thick. The council's gaze was a blade, cutting away pretense to expose the raw urgency beneath. Nantan stepped forward, voice low but firm, as he addressed the captive. "Speak! Your presence here is a breach of trust. Why do you come?" The spy's breath came ragged, words clipped and trembling. "The militia. Orders from higher up. They don't want your kind just run out. They want to end it for good. Eradicate every displaced soul in this region. Apache and settlers alike. No exceptions." The camp shuddered at the confession, like a firestorm licking the edges of a dry forest. Fear wove tightly through the gathered faces, and yet, in that same breath, a fragile unity began to harden. It was one thing to face distrust from enemies, but another to face annihilation. Bound now by the same threat, old wounds were forced to close, if only just enough to stand together. Leela's heart pounded fiercely in her chest, the sudden weight of shared peril shifting the camp's mood. She saw Nantan's jaw set against years of loss and rage. Taina's eyes sparked with tempered fire. Around the fire, young warriors straightened as if awakening to a call long whispered, but never spoken so openly. The spy, now silenced, was led away under watchful eyes as the council dissolved into tense discussion. Words were hushed but urgent, carrying the unmistakable scent of dread. Night fell heavy, like a shroud, settling over the camp, with a weight that pressed on every breath. Leela moved quietly among the lodges, feeling the sting of trembling hands and the whisper of fears too raw for words, yet no longer hidden. Hours later, dawn had barely begun to spread her pale light across the horizon when Nantan returned from his patrol. His face, normally a mask of stoic calm, was drawn tight with tension. He carried news heavier than the heat that would soon rise. "Tracks found on the ridge, fresh and deep," he said, voice low, eyes dark like storm clouds gathering. "Armed men, many. The militia moves closer. The attack will come soon, within hours, maybe less." A hush fell over the camp, thick as the morning fog in the valleys. The reality settled like cold steel. The coming storm was no longer a distant threat lurking in whispers. It was here, stalking the ridge, hungry and ruthless. Around the firelight, faces met with grim determination. Some let their gazes fall to the earth. Others clenched fists that trembled with anticipation and resolve. The fragile hope that had been weaving between them felt suddenly brittle, but still it clung stubbornly. Leela's breath came in shallow, steadying waves. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and unspoken prayers. She glanced at Nantan and Taina, standing side by side, pillars of strength beneath the creaking weight of the moment. The hours until the first gunfire would ring out were few, but their gravity was immense. They would either forge themselves anew beneath the storm or be shattered into forgotten. Dust on the frontier wind. In the deep silence before dawn's final touch, the camp held its breath, readying hearts and hands for what was to come. The attack was imminent, and the fragile boundary between survival and ruin had never been so thin. The dawn broke pale and hesitant, brushing the camp with a cold light that seemed reluctant to pierce the lingering shadows. Lila stood near the fires, her breath visible in the chill air, eyes never resting far from the somber circles of the council. Around them, the flickering flames painted wary faces with light and darkness, reflecting the fractured mood hanging heavy in the air. The spy's confession lingered among them like a poisoned wind. The militia's plan, not merely to chase away or threaten, but to wipe out, Apache and refugees alike. The weight of those words tied the camp together in unspoken dread, threading fear and resolve into a fragile bond. Nantan's gaze cut through the murmurs. Dark, steady, resolute. "We have no choice now but to unite," he spoke low, voice carrying across the ring of elders and warriors. "This is no longer just their fight, but ours." Yet not all was settled. Old shadows crawled beneath the surface, stirring dissent. The council's elders exchanged hardened glances. Some voices still clung to suspicion, fearing the risk of harboring outsiders would bring ruin. But the looming threat left little room for debate. Leela stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "I bear no intentions of harm. My family, these displaced souls, they seek only shelter. Together, maybe we can stand stronger." Her words hung in the cold breeze, fragile yet defiant. Taina, watching from the edge, nodded slowly, the line of her jaw softening just enough to suggest a tentative acceptance. Strength is born not just in blood, but in will. We must prepare, for the enemy shows no mercy. As the camp shifted into cautious activity, the tension coiled tighter. Patrols doubled their routes. Eyes scanned the ridges with wary attention. Leela shadowed Nantan and Taina, learning the signs of alert, the subtle shift of horses' restlessness, the tightening of bowstrings, the murmured warnings carried by the wind. That afternoon, as sun blazed against the thirsty earth, Leela mounted beside Nantan for a patrol. To the camp's edge, the dry air was thick with dust and the scent of crushed sagebrush. The horses' hooves stirred loose stones, the brittle crunch breaking the tense silence. Out of the still distance came a sudden, desperate cry, a sharp, breaking sound that sliced through the heat haze. Ahead, a small fire flickered, thin and restless against the looming mesas. From the tangled scrub emerged ragged figures, faces streaked with grime, eyes wild with fear. A small group of colonists, fleeing at full gallop, their pursuers close behind. Voices raised in anger, hooves pounding the earth in relentless chase. The air was thick with danger, urgency driving them like wind-driven leaves. Nantan didn't hesitate. With swift authority, he swept his horse between the colonists and their aggressors, a living barricade. His dark eyes burned with fierce resolve, unyielding as stone. The militia's riders faltered, uncertainty crackling through their ranks as they faced this unexpected defiance. Leela's heart hammered as she watched the small boy stumble, his leg injured, face wet with dirt and tears. Without pause, she reached down, pulling water and cloth from a worn saddlebag. The child's trembling fingers clung to hers, a fragile lifeline amid chaos. The harsh reality of the frontier pressed close, the line between hunter and hunted blurred in this desperate moment. Nantan's voice, low and commanding, carried the weight of ancient law and raw survival. This land has been carved by suffering, but space remains for those who defend, not take. The colonists gathered reluctantly, guarded and uncertain. But in that shared peril, barriers began to crack. Back in camp, the echoes of the encounter rippled through the lodges. The youth whispered with renewed interest, voices brightening with a hesitant hope. Yet, the elders' hardened faces remained like carved stone, resistance to change grinding beneath the simmer of urgency. Night drew its heavy shroud over the camp, the air dense with the scent of smoke, sweat, and unspoken fears. Suddenly, shadow moved, swift, deliberate, stitching between lodges like a living specter. Nantan and Taina responded without hesitation, their figures slipping into darkness with practiced silence. Lila's pulse quickened, every sense alert, as the camp held its breath. Moments later, the patrol returned, dragging a man cloaked in grime and terror. His eyes darted. In panic, lips cracked as he faced the inevitability of his fate beneath the council's scrutiny. The captive's confession confirmed their deepest fears. The militia's orders were relentless. Not even the displaced would be spared. Total eradication was their aim, without mercy or distinction. A cold stillness gripped the camp. Yet within that silence, a steely thread of unity wove through the gathered people. Fear no longer divided. They stood together, bound by the singular will to survive. Leela's breath came steady, hardened by resolve. She saw the fire rekindled in Taina's eyes, the rigid set of Nantan's jaw. The tribe, once fractured by mistrust, bent together beneath the weight of this shared threat. Before dawn, Nantan rode once more along the northern ridges. The dry earth told of heavy steps, fresh footprints pressed deep, the storm looming closer with each passing hour. He returned with news that settled like iron in the chest. "They come soon," he reported. "The militia advances. Hours separate us from battle." The camp's fires flickered uncertainly as faces met in grim understanding. The long, fragile road to trust had narrowed to a razor's edge. Tomorrow, the boundary between hope and devastation would be tested. Lila, standing between her protectors and newfound kin, clenched her fists against the chill. The coming storm was no longer distant. It was at the gates. The attack was imminent. Lila stood at the edge of the rocky defile, her breath shallow in the crisp morning air. Around her, the camp stirred uneasily, faces pale beneath the weak dawn light. The distant thunder of hooves had long since faded, replaced by a brittle silence that weighed heavily on every heart. The militia had come and gone, but their threat clung like smoke, thick and suffocating. The narrow canyon formed a natural fortress, its towering walls both shelter and prison. Cracks and crevices gave faint glimpses of the harsh landscape beyond. Lila's fingers traced the rough bark of a mesquite limb, grounding herself amid the restless murmurs of the gathered Apache. The refugees huddled close, eyes wide and restless, as if afraid the shadows themselves might betray them. With Nantan still nursing a grimace of pain, Lila found herself pulled into a role she hadn't imagined. Part leader, part protector. A fragile thread stitching together a frayed tapestry. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried beyond the campfire's flicker. "We've survived because we stand together," she said, steady despite the tremor beneath. "Not as strangers, but as one." The echoes of her words mingled with the rising wind, sharp as arrows slicing the cold air. Taina stepped beside her, fierce and unyielding, her gaze cutting through the nervous unrest. "Our strength comes not just from arms." A stubborn flare, flickering unpredictably. Suddenly, a youth's voice pierced the tension. A young man, barely a man, approached breathless, eyes bright with urgency. "I found a path," he said, voice rough. "A narrow trail on the west side, hidden among the rocks. It leads beyond the canyon." The camp murmured, eyes darting toward Nantan and Taina. The possibilities flickered. Escape, survival, a sliver of hope wrapped in danger. Nantan's gaze sharpened, weighing the risks in the silent calculus of war. "It is perilous, but it may be the only way." His hand rested briefly on Leela's shoulder, a silent pact passing between them. "We move soon before the militia closes the noose." Plans began to weave swiftly, quiet conversations unfolding like shadows shifting at dusk. Lila helped gather blankets and provisions, her fingers moving with purpose, the weight of lives pressing on her shoulders. The urgency was electric, a quiet storm gathering in every breath and glance. As the sun dragged itself higher, the camp braced in solemn readiness. Little children clung to their mothers' skirts, stoic faces masking fear. The elders sat in cold reverie, their lines hardened by years of endless struggle. The fragile unity the night had forged held by a thread thinner than a spider's silk. Suddenly, the distant rumble of horses echoed again, the sound that had haunted their days and invaded their nights. Lila's heart clenched as a cloud of dust rose over the ridge, dark and ominous. Then, as if drawn by the beat of destiny itself, a group emerged through the swirling dust. Warriors cloaked in the colors of neighboring tribes appeared on the horizon, their banners fluttering against the sky. The unexpected arrivals rode with purpose, allies answering a silent call. A gasp rippled through the camp. Faces that moments before had been etched with despair brightened with a sudden, fierce hope. The arrivals halted at the canyon's mouth, stationing themselves like statues carved from resolve. Nantan's eyes burned brighter, the flicker of his wounds overshadowed by a surge of renewed strength. Leela stepped forward, voice rising to meet the gale. "We are not alone." Her words carried, a beacon across the narrow canyon walls. Taina crossed her arms, nodding solemnly. "Tonight, we fight together. This land, these lives, we defend them as one." The camp's breath caught between shadows and firelight. The tide had turned, but the battle was far from over. The militia's threat still clawed at the edges like a lurking beast, and the night held 1,000 possibilities, some of them dark. The narrow path westward awaited, a treacherous chance at survival. Their courage, their choices, would shape the fate of many. As the first stars glittered cold above, the camp stirred with new resolve. Warriors readied weapons, fires burned brighter, and Leela's prayer hung in the still, tense air. that this fragile alliance could hold long enough to see the dawn. The next chapter of their fight was about to begin. And just as the camp prepared to move, the first crack of gunfire shattered the silence. The morning air hung heavy with unease as dawn stretched pale fingers over the camp. The once faint threat now luminously clear. The militia's presence was near, stalking the refugees and Apache alike. A dark cloud gathering over the cracked earth horizon. Leela stood amid the restless crowd, her eyes tracing the jagged ridges beyond, where dust stirred uneasily, whispering of an approaching storm. At her side, Nantan's steady form bore the weight of his fresh wounds, yet his gaze burned with fierce determination. Taina moved silently through the circles of warriors and displaced families, her sharp eyes reading every flicker of tension like the shifting patterns of smoke. The camp's fragile unity, forged in fear and hope, strained beneath the weight of what was to come. Leela took a steadying breath, the rough wick of a shawl pressed tightly in her hands. She had taken up a role she had never sought, but necessity had carved her into a reluctant leader, a bridge between worlds once thought irreconcilable. "We've survived this long because we stand together," she said quietly, voice low but resolute. "Not as strangers, but as one." Her words, carried on the brittle dawn breeze, stirred a faint murmur of assent among the gathered. Taina stepped close, her presence a fierce shield against the doubts that still lingered. "Our strength isn't just weapons and numbers," she added, her voice sharp, unyielding. "It's trust. Some elders are wary, but this girl has already proven herself a protector." She cast a brief glance toward Leela, acknowledgement flickering in her dark eyes like a coiled flame. Around them, wary warriors shifted uneasily, the age-old scars of betrayal and loss etched clearly in the lines of their faces. Suspicion was a stubborn ember, threatening to flare with the faintest gust. Yet amid the tension, a thread of hope wove silently through the camp. As the sun climbed higher, baking the earth, Nantan and Leela mounted their horses for a patrol along the camp's ragged edge. The dry air was sharp with sage and dust, the brittle crunch of hooves on cracked stone punctuating the oppressive stillness. Shadows curled beneath twisted mesquite trees. The heat haze blurred the distant mesas into wavering specters. Suddenly, the sharp crack of a desperate cry split the silence, raw, frantic, cutting through the stagnant air like a blade. Ahead, thin coils of smoke rose weakly against the sky, flickering like ghostly fingers reaching from the earth. Then came ragged figures, colonists, wild-eyed and disheveled, fleeing hard and fast, their breaths ragged and desperate. Behind them surged pursuers, rough men mounted with bloodlust gnawing at their snarled faces, voices shouting fierce threats as their hooves thundered, pounding the earth with relentless fury. The peril of the frontier pressed in, thick and suffocating. Without hesitation, Nantan wheeled his horse, planting himself like a living barricade between the desperate colonists and the angry riders. His dark eyes flashed, filled with ancestral fire and unyielding resolve, like granite carved by centuries of hardship. The militia's riders faltered, uncertainty flickering at the edges of their rage as they glimpsed the warrior's immovable stance. Leela's heart hammered wild in her chest as a small boy struggled into view, face smeared with dirt and tears streaking unwashed cheeks. His leg was injured, dragging unevenly behind him. With swift hands, Leela knelt, pulling water and cloth from a battered saddlebag. The child's trembling fingers grasped hers cautiously, a fragile tether in the chaos. For a fleeting moment, the desert's cruel sounds dimmed, the baying shouts, the pounding hooves, replaced by the fragile pulse of a silent bond, forged in terror and hope. Tin's voice broke through the quiet, low and commanding, steeped in ancient law, yet bristling with raw urgency. This land is torn by blood and strife, but there is space here for those who fight to protect, not to conquer. The colonists closed ranks hesitantly, their eyes searching uncertainly between the warrior and their pursuers. Fear braided tightly with defiance. The frontier blurred lines between friend and foe, hunter and hunted. Yet something fragile but real had emerged, an uneasy space of mutual survival. Back in the camp, echoes of the encounter spread like wildfire through dusky lodges and around flickering fires. The youth whispered eagerly, drawn by the courage of this outsider who had saved one of their own. But among the elders, faces remained carved from stone. Resistance, hardened by scars of betrayal and loss. As darkness deepened with swift certainty, a sudden movement twined through the camp, a shadow threading silently between lodges like a restless ghost. Nantan and Tana rose instantly, their lithe forms melting into darkness, senses sharpened to the keen edge of danger. Leela's pulse quickened, every breath felt thickened by suspense, every ear attuned to the faintest sound beyond firelight's reach. Minutes passed like heartbeats, each slower and heavier, until the patrol returned, dragging a figure cloaked in grime and palpable dread. The man's eyes darted wildly beneath dirt-caked brows, lips cracked and parched as he faced the inevitable under the council's searing gaze. The firelight cast stark shadows, revealing the weight of truth trapped beneath dust and fear. With trembling voice, the captive confessed the militia's merciless orders. Not merely expulsion, but complete eradication. Refugees and the Apache alike were to be hunted, without mercy or exception. A silent chill fell over the camp, the cold grasp of absolute danger settling like a shroud. Yet in that freeze, a fragile unity knit itself tight. Fear no longer divided. It bound them closer, a single pulse beating fiercely beneath the weight of annihilation. Leela's heart thudded, steeled by resolve. She met Tana's burning gaze and saw in Nantan's clenched jaw a flame rekindled. Where mistrust had once fractured them, the shared peril now forged a tenuous but unbreakable alliance. Before dawn, Nantan rode again, his measured pace tracing fresh, deep footprints pressed into the northern ridge's dust. Armed men, many. The war was no longer approaching, it was here. Returning with grim brevity, he spoke. They come soon. Hours may separate us from battle's first cry. Faces gathered close, under the weakening firelight, turned grim, eyes locking in silent understanding. The path to hope had narrowed to a razor's edge. Leela's knuckles whitened on her shawl's ragged hem. The horizon trembled with silent threat. The fragile thread between survival and ruin was stretched to its breaking point. The attack was imminent. The river's edge was alive with tension, every breath heavy as Leela's hands clenched at the cold stone beneath her. The soldiers had regrouped, their cruel intent shining in cruel eyes, but the warriors around her moved. With calm determination, shadows melding with the dawn. The final stand had begun. Nantan leaned against a boulder, his wound raw, but courage undiminished. His dark eyes locked with Leela's, sharing a silent promise. No matter the cost, they would not yield. Taina circled with the others, her sharp gaze watching every hesitation, every twitch beyond the camp's fragile safety. The plan was desperate, but clear. Use the land itself as their shield. The narrow canyons, jutting cliffs, and twisted brush offered the only hope against the overwhelming numbers pressing in, like a storm. Warriors crouched behind boulders, arrows nocked, while Leela positioned herself near the center, her voice steady, despite the pounding of her heart. "We have nowhere left to run," she said, "but we have everything to defend. Our lives, our families, our hope. Fight for this ground, for a future they can't take away." Her words carved through the cold air, sparking a fierce flame. Suddenly, rough hands seized her from behind, a firm grip that stole her breath for a moment. Soldiers had broken through the outer perimeter, dragging her toward the encroaching danger. Fear surged like fire in her veins. She twisted, grasped for a chance. "Leela!" Nantan's cry shattered the chaos. Rallying the defenders, Taina and other warriors charged, cutting through the enemy ranks with wild fury born of desperation. The creek roared nearby, the splashes matching the steady drum of hooves and gunfire. Every moment felt stretched thin, hanging on the edge of hope and despair. As soldiers closed in, Leela's gaze caught a glint, a narrow cleft hidden behind the brush. A fleeting thread of escape. With a sudden surge, she pulled free just as Taina's blade flashed, slicing through a soldier's arm. The air filled with shouted commands and the sharp rattle of musket fire. Behind her, Nantan shouted orders, moving swiftly to intercept. The defenders surged forward, pushing the attackers back, inch by grueling inch. The clash between desperation and resolve became a brutal dance, body against body, will against will. Through the shifting smoke and dust, Leela spotted the commander of the militia, tall and ruthless, eyes burning with hatred, fixed solely on extinguishing their lives and spirit. Her breath caught as Nantan met his gaze, raising his rifle in quiet challenge. The two men moved toward each other, their confrontation silent yet loaded with years of pain and hatred. Gunfire erupted, swifter than heartbeats. The militia commander faltered, wounded by precision and resolve. The crowd's roar surged as the tide turned. Soldiers, disorganized and beaten, began to falter, retreating under the relentless pressure of the united defenders. But no victory was without a cost. The ground bore the weight of fallen friends and the sharp cries of loss. Lila knelt beside a young boy caught in the fray, his small hand clutching hers with fierce trust. Her voice was soft but firm as she bore the pain and fear, a beacon amid the chaos. The militia's remnants dispersed into the dusty horizon, their threat momentarily quelled but not erased. The allies from neighboring tribes emerged over the ridge, their war cries a fierce chorus that lifted weary spirits. Nantan and Tana stood side by side, their battered forms a testament to survival. As the dust settled, the camp gathered beneath the sheltering cliffs, their faces drawn with exhaustion and guarded hope. Leela rose, her voice carrying through the quiet. "We have held our ground today, but the future demands more than survival. It demands a home." She glanced toward the council elders, whose hardened expressions softened with the wisdom of battles fought and lessons learned. The oldest among them, an elder who had watched many seasons, stepped forward. His voice was gravel and grace. "You, Lila, have shown courage beyond the dawn, a voice bridging fractured pasts. The Council blesses this land to become a place where our people and the displaced can coexist, not as strangers, but as one family." A ripple of relief and disbelief passed through the gathered. Tana's eyes gleamed with something nearly free of shadows, a cautious hope. Nantan reached for Lila's hand, their fingers entwined. The bond between protector and stranger had blossomed into something stronger, a shared legacy carved by fire and trust. Night fell softly on the new village, stars blazing cold and clear above. Fires burned warmly, casting gentle shadows over the faces of the old and young alike. Children laughed quietly, chasing the embers drifting skyward, unaware of the scars beneath the earth. Leela stood at the edge of the newly raised lodges, watching the horizon bleed colors of dawn, promising endless possibilities. The weight of the journey rested on her shoulders lightly now, replaced by the steady pulse of belonging. Together with Nantan and Tanya, she turned toward the heart of the camp, a promise fulfilled, a future forged in the fierce hope that had carried them through the darkest storms. Here, on this wild frontier, amid ashes and memories, they had built a home, a place where no one had to ask again for shelter, because they had found it within each other. And in that newfound unity, the legacy of all who had fought and fallen would live on, strong, enduring, unbroken.